Hello, and welcome to the 10th episode of Did You Know, in which I use the archives of the Northern Echo to shed a little light on some strange and wonderful historical fascinations. Now, did you know what it was like to be a witness to someone being hanged, to see the life being choked out of them, to be there in the prison exercise yard in Durham when Britain's greatest mass murderess was executed? Britain's most prolific mass murderess, Mary Ann Cotton. No, I couldn't even imagine what it was like until I read the Northern Echo's report of the proceedings, published exactly 150 years ago. It is grim, it is grisly, it is gruesome. But I also think it is strangely fascinating. And through the reporter's words, you are transported back in time so that you are actually there on Monday, March the 24th, 1873, as Mary Ann Cotton is executed for killing her stepson, Charles Edward Cotton, poisoning him with arsenic. And the rumor was that anywhere up to 21 other people around her she had dispatched over the course of 20 years. So let's go back 150 years to March the 24th, 1873, and at 7 o'clock in the morning, the reporters are all standing there at the prison gates waiting for admittance to get in to see the grisly scene. Because since public executions had been stopped a couple of years previously, the pressmen were regarded as the public's eyes for this state-sponsored killing. So they had a role in the execution, and so there were 24 of them standing there 7 o'clock at the gates waiting to get in. I imagine they were gossiping and probably smoking like most journalists seem to do, particularly back then. They would have been discussing in their gossip how the last female to be hanged at Durham was Mary Nicholson, some 74 years earlier in 1799. Now, she had been convicted of poisoning her mistress in the village of Little Stainton, which is just between Stockton and Darlington, just to the north of those towns. And she was a servant girl, and she was executed in 1799, but first time round the rope snapped, and so she got 45 minutes of unexpected extra additional life. And so she just kind of stood there chatting away to her relatives until a second stronger rope was acquired, and that was that. After the discussing such things as that, I'm sure the journalists, well, they did, because they wrote about it, they noticed the executioner, William Calcraft, arrived at the gates of the prison with his assistant. Now, the Darlington Stockton Times' reporter did not like the look of this assistant, whom he described as a tall, sallow, lank, cruel-looking individual. It's just a pretty damning description. None of the reporters knew the name of this strange assistant, although we now believe, or we now know, that it was a fellow called Robert Evans, who was a peculiar Welsh doctor who had a morbid fascination for death. And rather than taking a fee for being the executioner's assistant, he actually paid Calcraft for the pleasure of being there and watching someone die. So the reporters then followed Calcraft into the jail. Now, I have kept some of my lanyards that I've been given over my long and illustrious career of hanging around places to cover events. For example, this is a lanyard that was given to me when I covered the Queen's funeral. This is one from a Blair speech at Trimdon. This is a Boris Johnson visit. Conservatives. This is a royal pass for a now King Charles visit to the area. And I always wonder what lanyard the reporters were given when they went in to see the execution at Durham Jail. Instead of Royal Rota, to say something like Execution Rota, something a grisly souvenir like that. Now, once inside the jail, the reporters began to pick up bits of gossip. For example, they heard that a few days earlier, in Mary Ann Cotton's cell, a piece of soap had gone missing. When asked, she denied all knowledge of the piece of soap, and so they searched the cell, couldn't find it, and then the wardresses searched Mary Ann, and they found the missing piece of soap up her sleeve on the inside of her arm at the elbow. So there was speculation that Mrs. Cotton had intended to surreptitiously feed the soap to the baby which she had given birth to in the cell 2 months earlier. Her intention, allegedly, was to make the baby ill, and that would delay her execution. You couldn't possibly hang a mother whose baby was unwell. The vigilance of the wardresses had thwarted that plan, if it existed, and the baby, Margaret, was given up to Sarah and William Edwards of West Auckland. In a heart-wrenching final scene in the cell, as we told in episode 8 of Did You Know, Mary Ann had taken the black and white checked shawl off her back, ripped it in half, and wrapped the baby in half of it and given it to the Edwardses to take and bring the child up as their own. Now, after that bit of gossip, the reporter then picked up the news that on the day of her destiny, that very morning, Mary Ann had woken at 3:30 a.m. At 5:30 a.m. she had had a cup of tea, but she couldn't face a full breakfast. 3 local Methodist ministers were in the cell with her, giving her a degree of comfort. But she still insisted she was innocent of the crime, saying only that she might have accidentally administered the poison, as she had been missold it as a restorative by the village grocer. Now, I think she would have come under a degree of pressure to admit the crimes, because the state authorities liked proof that they were not hanging an innocent person. Now, does Mary Ann's attitude here indicate her innocence or the callous, calculating nature of her killing? Anyway, at 7:50 a.m., the bell of the prison began tolling mournfully. It was, said the Echo reporter, the death knell of a living woman. At that signal, the prison authorities, led by Under Sheriff Richard Bowser, entered Mary Ann Cotton's cell. And there she is, the bottom left of that picture on the front of the Illustrated Police News, in her cell, weeping away. Already in the cell was Calcraft, who had pinioned her arms, and from the cell they quite quickly processed into the exercise yard, where the reporters had been lined up in a military phalanx to watch. And they saw Mrs. Cotton was sobbing and trembling, but somehow she found the strength to walk the 80 yards by herself to the gallows. A chair had been brought along in the expectation that she wouldn't be able to make the trip, and so she was going to be sat in the chair, tied to it, and then carried that way to the gallows. The reporter noted how her pious ejaculations were being uttered in a low, fervent voice, which broke the silence and fell startlingly on the ear. Strange words, they seemed to come from a murderess's lips. "Heaven is my home," she said. The Darlington Stockton Times reporter said she was dressed in a black dress, and over her shoulders was thrown a black checked shawl. So this is really interesting, because This is the shawl that she is photographed in. This is the shawl she ripped in half to give to her baby. And these shawls were really fashionable and pretty expensive in South Durham until this picture of her was published by a Durham photographer immediately after the execution wearing said shawl, and the fashion then finished overnight. The Darlington Stockton Times said Mary Ann Cotton's face was rather pale and worn, and her hair was knotted tightly around her head. But the Durham County Advertiser, another one of my papers, said her head was bare, and her long black hair fell loose about her face. So they couldn't agree, even though they were both there, on whether her hair was tightly knotted or whether it hung down. However, all agreed that this was a terrible sight. A more dreadful object has surely seldom been seen under the skies than was this woman being led to execution with her tear-filled eyes upturned to heaven. That's the Advertiser speaking. Now, on the gallows, Calcraft and Evans worked quickly, tying up Mary Ann Cotton's legs, putting the noose around her neck and roping it up to the iron eye bolt in the crossbeam. In fact, they worked too quickly, for Evans appears to have pulled the bolt that opened the doors on which Mary Ann Cotton was standing before Under Sheriff Bowser had dropped his handkerchief, which was the accepted signal that the state was authorizing this execution, and it was happy that it could now go ahead. Never mind. With the words, "Lord, have mercy upon my soul," still trembling on her lips, Mrs. Cotton fell 3 feet, and Bowser, visibly affected by the awful scene, fainted. The Echo and the DNS didn't go into too great a detail about what happened next, but the Advertiser did, and all the books that have been written about Mrs. Cotton have included those details. Now, this is very difficult. I thought long and hard about how much of this I should include either here or in the paper, but I want you to be there to experience it all. So here goes. The Advertiser said the jerk was terrible, and the victim of the law spun round and twisted from side to side in a horrible manner. Calcraft, however, took hold of her by the shoulder and held her steady, and in a few seconds the facial contortions ceased. The sight was dreadful, and few were unmoved by it. For just 3 minutes, twitchings, more or less violent, were discernible in the body, and it swung slowly round. But at the expiration of that time, the motion ceased, and Mary Ann Cotton had paid the full penalty exacted by English law for her crimes. A black flag was raised over the prison wall, as you can see bottom right there, to inform the crowd outside, mostly 200, mostly women, that the deed had indeed been done. At 9 o'clock, the body was cut down and removed from the gallows, and at 10 o'clock, the first special edition of the Northern Echo is said to have hit the streets, bearing the dreadful news. Now, I don't know if 10 o'clock is actually correct, but in our bound files, there is a special 11:15 a.m. edition. As you can see there, it's really tightly bound in, but the special edition, the West Auckland Poisonings, Northern Echo Office, it says at the top there, Monday, 11:15 a.m. So the reporter must have worked really quickly at the scene there, and I guess he telegraphed his words back to Darlington to get onto the presses. Perhaps there was a runner who put the words onto the train, whizzed them down to Darlington in that way. But they got the dreadful news out pretty impressively quickly, even without the modern advantages of a mobile phone. At 11 a.m., The inquest in the jail concluded that Mrs. Cotton had had the death sentence carried out upon her, and the only debate was why the rope which had choked the life out of her was not in the coffin with her. Now, apparently, it was usual for the victim to be buried with the rope, and this was to prevent the rope from becoming a ghoulish souvenir. But the prison authorities said it was not a legal requirement, and so there was no need to worry about the missing rope. And so there was no further discussion on this. And we now believe that rather strange Welsh doctor, Robert Evans, the assistant, he had spirited the rope away and he took it home, and in his dining room in Wales, he had a fine collection of ropes hanging around the walls from the executions he had attended. Then, the inquest over, rather bizarrely, I think, there stepped forward two men from the West Hartlepool Phrenological Society. Now, phrenology was a fad of the day. Phrenologists believed that you could examine the lumps and bumps on someone's skull, and from those lumps and bumps, you could work out the character of the person who lived within. So if you have a big bump here, that indicates some flaw in your character. And so the phrenologists, in the interest of science, had been given permission to take a cast of Mary Ann Cotton's skull. So they cut off her long, luxuriant locks, took a cast of her skull, and one of which was kept in Durham. One cast was sent up to scientists in Edinburgh, and a third went to West Hartlepool. And then they put all of the luxuriant locks back into the coffin. The lid was screwed down, and at 2:00, Mrs. Cotton was buried in the jail yard next to the two Spennymoor murderers who had been executed a couple of months earlier. And then I guess everyone, including the reporters, went home. Calcraft the executioner caught the 3:05 p.m. train out of Durham, and when it stopped at Darlington's Bank Top Station, the celebrity finisher of the law was spotted, and the crowd dashed towards his carriage. The Echo said Calcraft drew up the window pettishly and, pulling the curtains forward, screened himself from the impertinent gaze of the curious. Of course, the executioner's job was over. His day was done. Mary Ann was just another one of the 450 people that he had legally killed. But he had conferred on Mary Ann an infamy in death that lives on to this day. So, thank you so much for watching this episode of Did You Know? Please subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Or why not go over to the Northern Echo's website, where you can find the article on which this is all based, and you can subscribe there in a variety of wonderful ways. Or just dash out and buy the paper on a Saturday when my nonsense goes in. And now, of course, you can say that, yes, you do know exactly what it was like to have been in Durham jail when Britain's most prolific mass murderess was executed exactly 150 years ago. Thank you for watching, and for now, goodbye.